Some words of Torah. We've been meeting in secret for months. Behind the hush of closed doors and secret knocks, we have found our way to one another, each with our own story, with our own backgrounds, our own station in society. For our own reason, we are fed up with the status quo, a status quo that seems to serve no one, Israelite or Egyptian alike, perhaps except Pharaoh and his courtiers. Tonight we'll receive a report back from Amos, Aaron says. Amos, how are things looking down by the water? Pretty grim, Amos answers. I arrived at the riverside, as I do every morning, but with all the blood, the fish have all died. Pharaoh has sent servants to collect their carcasses for fear of permanent contamination. Otherwise, not a soul in sight. I was sent home. No fish to catch today. People are scared. And word around town is Pharaoh is scared too. Moses looks pleased. He whispers in Aaron's ear. Aaron turns. Good, he says. Fear is good. Great idea, Ma'at, nodding toward a woman in the corner. We've narrowed in on the very heart of things, their quite literal lifeline. And the symbolism of the blood, I couldn't have thought of something more poetic myself. Ramses, do we think this is enough to move Pharaoh? Is he going to let the people go? Unfortunately, no, says a man in seemingly royal Egyptian garb near the front of the room. At the cabinet meeting today, he was talking about a counterattack. I think we need to escalate. Okay, what are we thinking? Aaron asks the room. Ideas? Miriam pipes in. If water is so important to them, let's stay focused there for a moment. What else will continue to disrupt their access to water? What about frogs? Someone shouts from the back. Lots and lots of frogs. Or one giant frog, someone yells from another corner. Brilliant, Aaron says. Let's hone in. This is a meeting of the Erev Rav. In Exodus, we are told that the night Pharaoh finally gave issue to let the people go, as they had been so demanding, the Israelites did not depart alone, but an Erev Rav rose with them. The term itself is never explained, and henceforward, there is no mention of the Erev Rav in the Torah. So there's much speculation as to what this Erev Rav is. But first, let's break it down etymologically. We have Erev, which many of us may recognize as the Hebrew word for evening, but that's not what it means here. At least we don't think so. The word has a second meaning, something much more akin to mixture, or something that is knit together. And then we have the word Rav, which means much, or many, or great. So out of the narrow place with the Israelites rose this great mixture, or a mixed multitude, as it's often translated. What comes to be understood in later commentary, thousands of years later, as a mingling of various nations, of strangers in their midst, of peoples of Mitzrayim who knitted themselves together with the Israelites. Okay? So what's the significance of this? Who were these people? Why did they leave Mitzrayim, the Hebrew word for ancient Egypt, with the Israelites? How many were there? Did they stay with the Israelites from there on out, or did they set off on their own? Were they opportunists who joined with the Israelites at the exact moment of their liberation? Or had they been a part of the community already? The Torah says literally nothing to answer any of these questions. Never again in all the stories of the wilderness is the Erev Rav mentioned. They simply appear to perhaps dissolve into the people. That is, as I said, in Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses, or even Tanakh, the expanded Hebrew Bible. But later, rabbinic and Kabbalistic literature tell a very different story of the Erev Rav. But to tell that story, we got to go back to Torah for a second. So in the book of Numbers, another book of Torah, following our previous story, and after a long time wandering in the desert, eating nothing but the magical manna that fell from the sky, we hear that the aspasuf, more on that term later, began to desire more. This increased desire led the Israelites to cry out and complain, saying, "If only we had meat to eat." Now, according to the Torah, this complaint came across as quite ungrateful, given that the divine had literally rescued them from servitude and was now providing them with ample food and water in a climate where none was to be found otherwise. So complaining was considered in this framework definitively a bad thing, and the aspasuf, the instigators of this misbehavior. So what of this aspasuf? Who or what were they? Again, the Torah doesn't say, as per usual, but according to medieval commentators such as Rashi and others, they are none other than the Erev Rav. It's a synonym, the mixed multitude of our previous story. So we're learning the Erev Rav, or the Aspasuf, planted the seed of this more, of this desire, and led the Israelites astray. It led them to break rank and act out of alignment with the gratitude that they owed to the source of life. So we find in this later commentary, again, this was written 2,000, 1,000 years later, we see a retrojection of this story the people, the Erev Rav, back into the story of the wilderness. We learn the Erev Rav from this story. We learn that the Erev Rav are still with the Israelites in the wilderness. Yet in their togetherness, they still maintain this sense of being distinct from one another in some way. There is the Aspasuf, or the Erev Rav, on one side, and there are the Israelites on the other. And in this framework, the Erev Rav, according to this rabbinic literature, they're the problem, not the Israelites. Okay, the Kabbalistic tradition, now even later in time, the medieval Jewish tradition that begins in medieval times, expands further on the presence of the role of the Erev Rav in the wilderness. So in the Zohar, which is a central book of Kabbalah, of this mystical tradition, they recount the narrative of the golden calf, or they reference the story from Torah. They cite the Torah, and the Torah says, when Ha'am, the people, saw that Moses was delayed in coming down the mountain, Ha'am, the people, gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us a god who shall go out before us, for that fellow Moses, we don't know what happened to him." Aaron then, in response to their ask, proceeds to make a golden calf, an idol for the people to worship. Now, as this story reads in its plain sense, obvious meaning, the creation of this idol is considered a grave transgression committed by the Israelite people against the God that just brought them out of Mitzrayim, out of this narrow place. But the Zohar is unwilling to accept this plain sense reading. Their logic is, if the Torah had wanted to say Israelites, it would have said Israelites, but it said the people. So the Zohar's authors choose to ask the question, or make up the question, if the people were the ones to instigate the transgression, who were these people? And no sooner is the question asked than answered. Why? They are the Erev Rav, of course. It was the Erev Rav who convinced Aaron to make a false idol, not the children of Israel. The Erev Rav planted the seed, stoked the fear, and led the people astray. Okay, this is not the only instance in the Zohar that the Zohar indicts the Erev Rav for doing something bad. In the Zohar, we see this whole new definition of Erev Rav emerging. In earlier rabbinic works, the Erev Rav were being scapegoated, they were being blamed, so that we could say the Israelites had done nothing wrong. That was just the Erev Rav that did the bad thing, the Israelites are good. But the mistakes of the Erev Rav appear unintentional, simply perhaps a symptom of not being an Israelite. But in the Zohar, we are painted this picture of an Erev Rav acting with deceitful intent. Not only does the Erev Rav transgress, but they intentionally do so in order to lead the Israelites astray. The Zohar extrapolates from this story. Anytime the Torah says the people, now, is what the Zohar is saying, it is referencing the Erev Rav. So anytime it says the people complained, the people challenged, the people rebelled, for the authors of the Zohar, these people are, never could be the Israelites, as I believe the Torah's authors intended. Rather, they're the Erev Rav, they're meddling, they're needling, they're attempting to destroy the Israelites from within. And so too today continues the Hasidic tradition, so again, even further in Jewish time. According to the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidism, in every generation, the Erev Rav rise up against the people Israel. And with this exegetical turn, the Erev Rav is sealed in the Jewish canon as the eternal enemy from within. This rhetoric of the enemy within is all too familiar in our times. Quoting the current leader of the free world, but you know, we do have an enemy within. We have some very bad people, and those people are also very dangerous. They would like to take down our country. As I believe we in this room recognize, there's no enemy infiltrating the United States trying to take us down from within, at least not in the way that Trump is implying. We are merely made up of a patchwork, an Erev Rav, if you will, a knitted multitude of peoples with vast ways of being, all trying to build life together on one land, under one banner, within a system rooted in mass inequality, built by slave labor upon land that was stolen, in an increasingly globalized and interconnected world characterized by mass migration due to the impact of war and colonization and climate catastrophe, right? Simple truth. But Trump's goals, they're not served by acknowledging that truth. So he constructs an enemy within as a rhetorical strategy to achieve his goals. And what are those? For Trump, I believe his goal is consolidation of power. If people are afraid, people obey. Therefore, everyone's existential fears, including ours, the Jewish people, become his playthings used in pursuit of this power, and all actions, no matter how harmful, defensible in the name of protection. In the case of Trump, I think it's easy to see through this false rhetoric and identify ulterior motive. But when it comes to us, it might be far less obvious that we are engaging in the act of constructing an internal enemy, let alone our motive for doing so. So let's return to our story. Why did our ancestors over thousands of years take two words from the Torah that are never again mentioned together and weave them into a grand tale of eternal precarity and what could be considered the greatest threat to the Jewish continuity and existence? Why did they fashion for themselves an enemy within? The authors of the Torah wrote a book that's imperfect, of imperfect characters, of imperfect stories, of flawed characters acting in flawed ways, and yet still being deserving of life, of land, of community, of home. But its later Jewish readers and interpreters could not grok that imperfection for whatever reason. They could not grok having an imperfect ancestor. Rather than acknowledging that our mythic ancestors frequently and continuously messed up and still not only survived, but remained in covenant, in relationship with the one that they caused harm to, God in this instance, they instead invented an enemy onto whom all blame could be cast, thus rendering the Israelites wholly innocent. And then they led us, I think accidentally, to fear that illusory enemy, not only historically, not only literarily, but contemporarily. So it begs the question, why were our ancestors unable to accept the imperfection of their ancestors? Perhaps it was because they didn't want to see themselves as in the lineage of wrongdoers, or perhaps their present was riddled by wrongs, by questions, by loss of faith, and they needed ancestors they could believe in, ancestors who modeled a different way. And if they could just change the story, so they tweaked the meaning just a bit here and there, just slightly, and they scapegoated this other group that they made up, and it didn't matter anyways. What could be the harm of that? And before they knew it, they had created a beast that grew out of their control until they forgot altogether that this beast, the enemy, was of their making. They began to fear the work of their own hands. I do not believe our ancestors, as was the case with Trump, had malicious or selfish intent in the construction of an enemy within. Rather and more often, I believe people construct an enemy within because they're not willing to face the real root of a problem and their own culpability within it. But as we've learned, avoidance of culpability can create new and often harmful realities. The concept of the Erev Rav as the enemy within has been thoroughly integrated into Jewish thought and life ways, quite explicitly within Orthodoxy, where the danger of the Erev Rav as the enemy within is discussed openly, but I believe also more subtly and unknowingly within liberal and secular Judaisms. And this concept's prevalence, however subtle, I believe is one primary factor leading to the increasing isolation of the Jewish people from other peoples with whom I believe we would otherwise be in solidarity. Let me provide an example. I met recently with a representative from the Jewish Community Relations Council to discuss our relationship with them and some differences I saw in how they were organizing versus how Or Shalom was organizing in these times. One thing we discussed were the ceasefire resolutions that were being voted on back a year or two ago. I said to them, putting aside those ceasefire resolutions were right, were wrong, I fear the optics. I'm worried that by an organized Jewish bloc showing up en masse on one side of the aisle and seemingly every other marginalized community showing up in coalition on the other side of the aisle, we're setting a dangerous precedent. And while their argument against the resolution may have been international affairs have no place in city politics, the optics of this positionality, whether it was intentional or not, is that we, the Jewish people, can only be safe if we are siloed and completely alone, set apart from other peoples. That we, the Jewish people, are only safe if they're not safe. It's a zero-sum game. Except Jews did not fall on just one side of that aisle in those conversations. There were Jews, potentially in this community, on both sides of the aisle. And this ideological aisle expanded, I think, to become much more than just what you thought about a ceasefire. It became a litmus test of your Jewishness. Who is a bad Jew and who is a good Jew? Who is a real Jew and who is the Erev Rav, the enemy within? And we're all accusing each other of that. Except that none of us are the Erev Rav. None of us are the enemy within. In the sense of enemy within, there is no such thing as an Erev Rav. The American Jews speaking against the ceasefire resolution are not the Erev Rav. The American Jews speaking for the ceasefire resolution are not the Erev Rav. The American Jew who believes the Jewish people will never be safe without the state of Israel is not the Erev Rav. The American Jew who believes the existence of Israel as a Jewish state makes Jews everywhere less safe is not the Erev Rav. The American Jew terrified of rising anti-Semitism is not the Erev Rav. The American Jew sick of being called an anti-Semite for their anti-Zionism is not the Erev Rav. Neither is the Palestinian American crying out for their family under bombs falling. Neither is the average American citizen protesting in support of Palestine. None of them, none of us are the Erev Rav. We may not all agree about the path to liberation. We may not all agree about what keeps us safe or even whose safety we should prioritize and in what order, but we're not enemies. Turning each other into the enemy serves no one. Turning the other into the enemy serves no one. In fact, is an act of harm against both self and other. We do not get free that way. No one gets free that way. I want for there to be an Erev Rav, need for there to be, but in the sense that I believe the Torah's authors intended, of peoples who too required liberation and saw their liberation as inextricable from ours. There's a midrash that states the Erev Rav did not join with the Israelites just at the moment of their liberation as opportunists, but joined with them far before. And thus, when the firstborn of every ancient Egyptian was struck down during the 10th plague, the firstborn of the Erev Rav, despite many of them being Egyptians themselves, survived. They were so integrated into the Israelite people that their fates were now bound together. Their safety, our safety. Their fates, our fate. What would have happened if the Israelites had slammed the door in their face? Not allowed the Erev Rav in? How many more deaths? How much more suffering? Would the Israelites even have gotten free if not for the Erev Rav choosing to rise with them? I personally want to follow the lead of these mythic ancestors. The ancestors who chose to be vulnerable enough to let other people in, to trust them, to trust their motives, their intention, even if doing so might very well have increased the risk, threatened their safety. But instead, the Erev Rav was saved, and so too were we in kind. I know so many peoples who are ready and willing to be our Erev Rav. Can we find the same eagerness to be theirs? I see us already on our way there. What will make us feel safe enough to join with them, knowing that no one's safety, not theirs and not ours, no safety is ever guaranteed, not by solidarity and not by sword. But what I do know with total faith is now is not the time to be alone. So what if our ancestors had chosen to read the story another way? Rather than turning the Erev Rav into the enemy within, who in every generation rises up against us, what if we had understood the Erev Rav as our allies in shared struggle? Those who joined us not to destroy us, but because they too required liberation, and they realized that their liberation and our liberation were one and the same. What if the Erev Rav were the reason we got free? For at the end of the day, the Torah does not say that the Erev Rav rose against us. It quite literally says the Erev Rav rose with us. Cries of anguish pierce the simmering air as we all gather in close. The smell of the blood coating the doorway is still fresh, still pungent. Everyone appears worn down and terrified, yet in the reflection of each other's eyes, there glimmers glorious possibility. Some had made the choice to stay behind in the end. They had smuggled in jewels and coins and every kind of treasure from their homes across the river and showered it upon us, hugging us close as they did. And some had gathered their own rucksacks and stood, too, ready to depart with us. Moses whispers into Aaron's ear, and Aaron reports. Pharaoh has given in to our demands. He is allowing us to take leave, but we do not know what is next for us. His heart may very well harden again, so we must make haste. At dawn, we rise. At dawn, we rise.
We rise, humbly hearted rise, won't be divided, rise, with spirit to guide us, rise, in hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here, in hope, in prayer, we're children rise. Elders with wisdom rise. Ancestors surround us, rise. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise up from the wreckage, rise with tears and with courage, rise fighting for life, we rise. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here. In hope, in prayer, we find ourselves here. In hope, in prayer, we're right here, and we rise. Humbly hearted, rise. Won't be divided, rise. With Spirit to guide us, rise. May we rise together into this new year.